Hey guys, welcome back to doremicom channel. I am doremicom. We're going to be talking a little bit about Infinity Terrain, and basically a lot of this review is really in more of the notion of the steps I've taken in order to get to the point where I'm starting to make terrain that's more usable from a demoing perspective or a tournament perspective, where the terrain you really want to have people on equal footing. So if you want to play Infinity on a completely flat board, while I find that that will completely not give you the experience that you really want when you're playing Infinity, and it might not be what I would call fun, please feel free to play Infinity however you want to play it. I'm just going to go through some steps, walk you through some phases on how this has kind of been more or less what I feel is the most balanced terrain that I've built thus far. So that basically if you're going out and you're building terrain for Infinity for the first time, you might be able to skip some of the earlier mistakes that I made and be able to get to that point where you're playing on a very even battlefield. Again, the focus is on, demoing tournaments, and quite honestly, I think most people would have fun on a board where the game feels a little bit balanced as opposed to very lopsided. I want to give a shout out to a user. I'm going to put his name right here. I forget who it is, but I will look it up before I post the video, who actually brought a lot of this to my attention when we were using this board, which was the original demo board that I created. You can find it on the Turbo Terrain. It's Turbo Terrain 3, where they made mention of the fact that it seemed like the game felt very focused on just having long-range weapons, finding a place to hide, shooting from afar, and really the other team not having much of a chance. But let's go back to the very beginning. Let's start from absolute scratch, looking at a board that has no terrain. So if we start with a blank board, we can see that this kind of doesn't work for pretty much any game, but it really doesn't work for Infinity. And the reason are those models on the far end. Some things that your terrain should be doing is stopping rushes by tags, which have elevated movement speeds, or people on vehicles, again, elevated movement speeds that could really impact a game. You don't want a scenario that you've seen in other games historically, like Warhammer Fantasy Battle, where someone can just go, I go first, well then they win. So you want to avoid this kind of rush by these kind of guys. You also want to avoid the rush by linked teams. These are models that are grouped together in such a way that they can all move together with one order. And the last thing that you really want to avoid are long-range weapon specialists like sniper rifles and HMG weapons. In a board that has absolutely no terrain, a strange thing kind of happens because I actually don't know how well the first player would actually work, because the opposing team would be able to have line of fire to every single member on the other team, so if they activated anyone, the entire other team would be able to fire at that model that received the order. So we take our first step and we start adding some ground level terrain. Now ground level terrain is things where people aren't really going to get much of an advantage from climbing on top of. They're really used more from the standpoint of doing two things. One, providing cover if a model is standing directly behind it. So for instance, the Laseek here, for instance, if the terrain covers up at least where it comes to the knee on the model, then that model is considered to be in partial cover. The other really good thing about ground level terrain, once you have walls that kind of have elevated terrain as well, is that you don't have situations where models can advance straight ahead. They have to spend some of their movement to walk around the ground level terrain. And this is good. It kind of helps a little bit with the rushes in the game. So let's take a look at the board that we built during Turbo Terrain 3. And there's no Swiss cheese terrain. We have elevated terrain. We have some ground level terrain down here. We have some cover pieces on the upper levels of terrain, and from an initial standpoint, it's easy to film, it's easy to demo with. But once you have some experience playing this game, you start to realize that there is a shortcoming to this terrain, and the shortcoming, honestly, are these slightly larger blocks and the fact that the majority of the walls are slightly under 2 inches. Let's go to a more level look at the board so you can see why this is an issue. As I was saying, the larger blocks are the concern, and the reason is that the variance between the height of the model and the wall means that if they're not completely against the wall, there's an outstanding chance that a camping sniper on one of the higher levels, and with a Lasique it's even more dangerous because she can hang off the wall as such, providing herself cover and with mimetism, but still being able to shoot this Golem Doctor model if the model is just simply there. And even worse, because these blocks exist in the deployment zone in such a way that the 2-inch walls become problematic for the entire game. Upon deployment, you can have models that are completely ready to make the game an absolute nightmare for the other team, and not in a way that is any sense of the word fun. The issues with the 2-inch wall terrain are actually exacerbated by tags, because now I have everywhere I can use the tag to get cover. He can sit in his deployment zone and pick people off as they walk, with very little opportunity for the opposing model to fire. With a tag up on a 3-inch block, being directly against a piece of terrain might not be enough, and they might have complete line of fire. But what this terrain does not do very well, and it's probably the only major issue with this particular piece of terrain, is dealing with models that are choosing to just camp from the very onset of deployment and effectively ruin a game. So now let's take a look at the terrain that I've called Propaganda Labyrinth, and this is what the Infinity tutorial is running on. Walls, instead of being just slightly less than 2 inches height, walls are 3¼ inch or 4¼ inch. In order to maintain any sense of cover on the elevated terrain, the walkways have been sunk in by ½ inch. The fact that the walkways are sunk has some very interesting things about it. The fact that the Lasique is even on the slightly elevated terrain, the Golem that she is firing against can be all the way back here before he becomes part of her line of sight. Because even the smaller walls are 3½ inches, which has a greater amount of height between what the size of the model and the top of the wall, it casts a shadow. You kind of can see that the line of sight, first off, she can't just look over a thin wall. It has depth with the same height in the background, so her field of vision gets reduced dramatically. Don't get me wrong, the Lasique now becomes very, very tough to deal with for models that are up on that higher level, but it gives the opponent an opportunity to actually use the terrain to sneak around and shoot at her from behind. This offers all the tactical advantage and the excitement of actually coming up and developing a strategy around the models that you have in your army list and those models that you're opposing. This terrain provides that. The only thing that this terrain honestly is missing is I need more ground cover. I chose not to put it into the Infinity tutorial only because I wanted the focus to be on the rules and on the models themselves. So I didn't want to clutter it up too much. The other great thing about this terrain is that it's incredibly easy to assemble. You take 2 floorboards, take a 2-inch piece of polystyrene, glue them together, and you're done. Maybe throw some paint on it real quick and call it a day. Now again, you might say, but Brian, I see this Swiss cheese terrain down here, and doesn't this piece of terrain cause issues? Not really. As you can see, we've placed a couple of, even if a model is standing way up here, again, because of the delta between the height of the model and the height of the general wall area, I now have the flexibility to roam directly against the wall. And granted, you might be causing your opponent to waste more orders to move in such a fashion as to stay out of line of fire from the person that's up in that top tower area, but it doesn't provide a lethal tactical advantage for one or the other armies. This concludes the Infinity Terrain tutorial for FaceTube Wargaming's Terrain Week. Up next, we got Wargame Painting. Stay tuned.